Well, welcome everyone. This is Bernie Siegel. I'm the executive director of the nonprofit Regenerative Medicine Foundation and chair of the World Stem Cell Summit. So we have an interesting presentation to provide. I'm doing a fireside chat, which is unusual, actually, with a esteemed colleague, Alan Jakimo, who will introduce himself in a minute. And we are going to be talking about some topics, I would call it rarefied air for the World Stem Cell Summit, because Alan and I had co-authored a book chapter for a few years ago, and it was on patient advocacy and the impact of advocacy on the field of regenerative medicine and regulation. I'm a patient advocate. I'm a cancer survivor many years ago. And I chose to leave my successful law practice and become engaged at full-time to promote the field of stem cells and regenerative medicine. It's been a journey and a half. And Alan has monitored that over the years, is a dear friend, legal expert himself. And we have noted and dissected patient advocacy in a way that perhaps hasn't been done before. And there are applications to this for many other areas of what I would call future technologies. So that's the broad sweep of subject matter. And I want to turn this over to my friend, Alan Jakimo, and to perhaps embellish the tale.
Sure. Thank you, Bernie. And thank you all for viewing our fireside chat today. We really appreciate your participation in the World Stem Cell Summit 2022, and as part of that participation, viewing this fireside chat. I spent decades as a lawyer practicing in the area of transactional law in essentially two industries, life science and information science. So I was in that position as a transactions lawyer. I was gaining a lot of information on stem cell biology. And I met Bernie in 2007. Together worked on a lot of interesting case studies. I'll refer to them in that fashion. And you can see them listed along the left-hand side there. And that dissection that Bernie was talking about with respect to advocacy is a toolbox. And depending upon the type of issues that are being presented, as an advocate, you want to use one tool or another. That chapter that Bernie referred to that we wrote a few years ago really focused on the first 5 of those historic case studies. The clonate case, Bernie can talk about that a little bit more. The UN debate over cloning, Proposition 71, which of course gave birth to CIRM, and Shirley v. Sebelius, which was the NIH guidelines case that got all the way to the Supreme Court. Genetics Policy Institute contributed a Friends of the Court brief in that case. And then the 5th case study that we looked at was the Provenge case, the autologous dendritic cell therapy case. Shortly after we wrote this chapter, we're very involved in the legislation with the part of that law that had to do with the establishment of regenerative medicine advanced therapies, RMATs as they're called. And as all of you know from being participants in this year's World Stem Cell Summit, we'd add longevity, artificial intelligence, humanity's race to space. And then another current topic that is really important is work beyond the primitive streak in developmental biology. If we were revising that chapter today, we would be adding these topics, and we'd be speaking in terms of the right-hand side of this slide, in terms of our advocacy tools. But we want to add another dimension to this. And the other dimension that we want to add to this really follows from that policy making reference in that right-hand column. You can see it there under legal and political processes. What we've done is we've added the dimension of policy making here. And what do we mean by policies? We mean access, autonomy, but not autonomy in the classic bioethical sense, but autonomy in broad form for each stakeholder involved in healthcare. We're talking about cost. Back in 2011, I think it was Standard & Poor's that lowered the credit rating of the United States, and not because of our industrial capacity having any problems, but because long run, if healthcare expenditures in the US continued at the rate that they were growing, and I think have continued to grow since then, at some point, it's not sustainable. So cost is a really important aspect of healthcare policy. Another healthcare policy is information. Another example of not a classic policy, but a policy that's become really important over the last 20 years or so in healthcare is the market-driven aspects of policy in that area. And by market-driven, we mean both consumerism and the corporatization of healthcare. The whole concept of the Affordable Care Organization, which is memorialized in the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act of 2010. And then the last policy to area of policy that we want to focus on, again, a classic member of the 4 policies that have been classically written about access, autonomy, cost, and quality. And Bernie, let me turn it back over to you.
Well, all I can say is I agree with everything Alan said. What occurred back in the very end of 2002 and 2003 changed my trajectory and career forever, because it's a well-worn tale, which I'm not going to repeat, by the way, other than to tell you a group claimed they cloned a baby, and it was an international cause celeb. They made the announcement in Florida, and I chose to take one of these things that Alan and my toolkit, litigation, because that's what I knew. And it occurred to me that that group was impacting in a negative way something called stem cell research. I had in 1997 a bout of colon cancer. And at the time in 2002, I realized that I owed my life to science and medicine and the advancements. And as they say, knock on wood, I've been healthy since. Very lucky man. Well, this group that claimed they cloned a baby had stampeded laws that not only would have banned a promising field of embryonic stem cell research, but potentially thrown practitioners trying to use these stem cells into prison, heavy fines, and even patients could be impacted. Knowing that and listening to this group, I realized from my background as a lawyer that had been involved with children's rights in my career and handling matters in juvenile court, that any person who's aware of a child, in this case, an alleged clone child and an international cause celeb, should be looking out for the welfare of the child. So I filed a case. And basically, I exploded what appeared to be a publicity stunt of this group and had all the glory of 15 minutes of fame. And had found myself immersed with a bullseye as to why an individual would get involved in a case like that. I did it because I thought it might be the first case to protect a human clone, and that I could smell a rat when I saw it. I felt what I felt was a publicity stunt, but it wasn't known at the time, and it was a big deal. Having come away with the reputation of having burst that bubble and having realized in myself that I had the power to speak and talk about things, even though I wasn't a professor, even though I wasn't a scientist, even though I was just a practicing attorney, but with a story, I could have an impact on this field. And I was invited by the International Society for Stem Cell Research Rudolph Yanish, uh, uh, and Dolly the sheep's father, Ian Wilmot, as their guest at this first meeting in 2003. And when I went to that meeting in Washington, D.C., and I made the rounds in D.C. and met Leon Kass of the President's Council on Bioethics, social conservative, and went to the headquarters of the Biotechnology Industry Organization and met the leadership of the Juvenile Diabetes Research Fund and had the backing of the scientists and attended this meeting where I seemed to be the only patient advocate civilian in the room of 650 scientists. The scientists appreciated what I had done in bursting the bad publicity. And I emerged with a group of scientists that said, Bernie, you create an organization that will be an advocacy organization for our field, and we'll join your science advisory board. And that allowed me to kick the door open. And I decided to give up my lucrative law practice, even though I still had a child at college, because I saw this as a path forward. Sometimes when you get to that fork in the road, or you're the only person in the world doing something, you may as well do it. At least that was my perspective at the time. I had the audacity to do this with the backing I felt of the scientific community. What I was skilled at, Alan, was promotion. And one of the unmet needs was creating a conference, I felt, that would bring all the stakeholders and the voice of patients together. And that led to the journey which you pointed out and the big policy battles that were engaged, where there were advocates on both sides fighting over embryonic stem cell research in many different venues, including the United Nations, in Congress, in states. And how was the field of embryonic stem cell research going to emerge? And it became more than that. As I realized, as I interacted with patient advocates, people like myself, civilians, that there was an advocacy movement brewing, because at the time, the social conservative movement and the presidency of George W. Bush was perceived as trying to restrict this unbelievably promising field of medicine and research. And Alan, what was so interesting about it is that the President Bush's first speech to the American people after being elected president was on the issue of stem cells. And about a month and a week later was 9/11. But stem cells and the research into embryonic stem cells was restricted. Federal funding was not going full force in it. And as it's been said, that NIH, the National Institutes of Health, is perhaps the greatest engine of scientific advancement in the history of man. And if those resources couldn't be put into this, how could this field, this salvation field of medicine, biomedicine, ever come into being? Now, I didn't know much about cloning, and I didn't know much about stem cells. And my 10th grade biology teacher would be very surprised at what I decided to do with my life. But I found somehow the wherewithal and such skill sets as I had of a cause that became so fascinating and interesting with so many stakeholders and an ecosystem so broad. And my natural curiosity, it wasn't hard for me to immerse myself in this in a way. When I scope it out now, some 20 years later, I realized all those meetings that we created together, all those World Stem Cell Summits, where I would be inviting hundreds of speakers personally by email, year after year after year, what we built was a trusted network, a network that's matured, of leadership and up and down hierarchies, right? My educational process was not just dealing with the lofty deans of medical schools, although I had the privilege of doing it. And it wasn't only the lab scientists and the emerging entrepreneurs that were out there. It was also patients, and just like me, that were engaged and saw this in what became not just some sort of esoteric scientific issue, but saw it as a personal health issue now. Think about that. They saw it as something for their friends, their families, and their loved ones. It represented salvation. And those that oppose something like this, it's akin to crushing hope. Well, that unleashes a counterforce that has led to where this field is today. In an accelerated ecosystem, right out of Future Shock and Alvin Toffler, the book that influenced me in college, with all of these converging technologies. So something that we couldn't imagine now is beyond almost human comprehension with all of these technologies converging. So that's where I sit today, honored to be able to create an event that has worldwide attention and an education event, totally as a nonprofit, and a small nonprofit, the Regenerative Medicine Foundation is, but it has allowed me to have some voice in the future of our species in the world. Hopefully a good force and a good voice that will get things done. So that is sort of the context of a conversation that I wanted to share with you and the wider audience. And imagine what we are going to be dealing with and what skill sets we have to bring to this field of advanced technologies and be successful. So we'll have a soft landing, understanding. This is the thing, we have to understand who's in favor, who's against, whose ox is being gored, as Martin Luther famously said. Whose ox is being gored? Who has a stake in this? Only by understanding all of those points of views can we accelerate this field successfully and all the other technologies that we need to get the job done.
You added a word in what you were just saying, and the word that you added is salvation. And I think that connects to one of the major topics at this year's summit that you've become very involved in, and it's the field of longevity. So I'm wondering if you could comment for a few minutes on how longevity fits into this intersection of advocacy and healthcare policy.
Well, when you look at the case study that you presented in the slide, first, we look at this field of stem cells and regenerative medicine as an ecosystem. And that's been my mindset on how to perform work that has been meritorious, that can help a cause. And when you look at our ecosystem, there's an application to the field of longevity and health span and an interconnection between them. But what are the big segments of each ecosystem and what are the shared segments? So on one, if you were looking at this, science and medicine, all right, biomedical research, the application of this to patients, the medical specialties, the institutions of science and medicine, the societies, stakeholder one. Then we look at the societal aspects of this, the patients, the advocates, the medical philanthropies, the societal groups, the transhumanists, the religious groups, the environment, all societal points that we have to consider with many, many stakeholders all around. Then we think about government, not just the United States, but geopolitical issues, law, of course, law in all its aspects, human rights, ethics, moral philosophy. it's all part of the societal side of determining what's going to be next. Each has experts and voices and own groups. Then I think about publications, literature, media, and popular culture. All right, we have to look at that. And finally, the great industrial side of this, investors, industries, facilities, and workforce. Who's going to be performing the work, the technical workforce? All of these things together, Alan, are critical components. So we understand what has been accomplished with historically advancing our field of stem cells and regenerative medicine. For example, Prop 71, and I was on the governing board of the Prop 14 campaign, aggregating $12 billion for research and development of stem cells for regenerative medicine for the California Institute for Regenerative Medicine, an unheard of, unique state institution. Louis Brandeis said states are the laboratories of democracy, right? So we have we have that. So how does that apply to the field of longevity? And what does longevity have to do with this? Well, I had to give you that background because there is a tremendous amount of interest in extending the healthy human lifespan and the health span. But that has many obstacles and a lot of advantages. And if that indeed is a meritorious goal, how will we reach it? What are the headwinds that we're facing? And how is that same ecosystem applied? That is a matter of great fascination to me, because understanding with people like Jeff Bezos and others investing billions in supporting this research, and much of this research is related to regenerative medicine. How can that be utilized in a way? And how are we going to make sure that should we be able to extend the healthy human lifespan, will there be access? Will there be distributive justice? How is the farmer in Malawi going to take any benefit from something that will extend the lifespan of a billionaire that looks perhaps as if having all the money in the world, they may as well have the time to spend as much of it as they can. That perception, by the way, is not necessarily a correct perception. There is an essence of humanity in all of this and trying to alleviate chronic disease and suffering. And the promise we have with regenerative medicine is so astonishing. We might be able to actually create that trajectory. But to what end? That's the question. And that's something that I'm interested in, is that might be the next level of dealing with a global ecosystem to see if we can get that done. And should we get it done, of course, is the question as well.
Just like healthcare has two sides to it, a public and a private side, longevity has a private side and a public side. The private side, of course, is for each individual to have quality longevity, quality laden longevity. But then there's also the concept of not only longevity of an individual, but longevity of humanity. And that conjures for me all sorts of topics and issues relating to the race into space in order for humanity to maintain humanity over the eons of time when humanity may hopefully still be around, but Earth won't be, at least in the current habitable form in which we know it today. So we were supposed to talk about artificial intelligence next, but let's go to that race to space concept, because I think that was inherent in longevity, as you were saying, and then we'll come back to artificial intelligence.
One of the things that have also fascinated me, and I've developed a tremendous and worthwhile rapport with the US National Lab on the International Space Station, formerly known as the Center for Advancement of Science and Space. And I was so intrigued by the fact that stem cells are being sent into low Earth orbit. and the promise of microgravity. Now, as a fan of popular culture, it excited me that this has so much promise. And when you think about the implications of it, are we really going to send colonies to the moon and the Mars, or as Peter Diamandis hopes to live to age 250, of course, we're talking about the founder of Singularity University, in the X Prize, that's what his goal is. So he can be on a starship and go somewhere. Really? Okay. Taking that all at face value, we're going to really have to find ways to regenerate cells. To the harsh environment of space is something that is real. And can we use what we're learning in low Earth orbit and with these stem cells and apply them to understanding these cells and the magnificent promise and potential of this, as we said, it's a salvation type technology to find, it's a whole different new pillar of medicine, one could argue, cell therapies. All right, all things considered, I found it fascinating. And that's why we provide this platform at the World Stem Cell Summit for this. I think there's a societal side that I always keep in mind, and it's what we can call popular culture or science fiction and literature. And I think that's an important field, and I think it inspires humanity to go beyond the realm of the here and now and really think about the promise of our species and the totality and immensity of the universe, which we have this little sliver of time to observe and interact with. Well, all those things are very they capture the imagination of many, many people and inspire many people. And harnessing that interest to lead where there are scientists that are enthused about sending their cells from a petri dish into low Earth orbit and developing the robotics necessary and the bioprinting and all these emerging technologies at the same time is a force to create goodwill and interest in science and the promise of science and capturing the imagination, just like John Kennedy, when he said, we're going to go to the moon because it's hard, all right? We're going to take this step. That's all part of the cultural milieu in which we all inhabit now. So for all of those reasons, this the toolkit that we're talking about needs to be applied to this, because there has to be resources to do this mighty endeavor. And just because it's impossible doesn't mean it shouldn't be done. And by the way, on the other side, flip side of the coin, there are geopolitical considerations always, and military, and war, and technology that have driven so much progress and destruction in the history of our species. It's all grist for the mill.
So in what you were just talking about, there were two references, I think, that conjure all of the both hype and real value of artificial intelligence, and you made a reference to singularity, and you made a reference to robotics. So these issues, longevity and race to space to maintain humanity over the eons of time, and that area of artificial intelligence, they're not separate topics, they really intersect, and the fact that you reference singularity and robotics in that context calls that out. You and I, of course, have spent lots of time speaking about artificial intelligence. We've both read Max Tegmark's Life 3.0, and the first chapter of that book is just uh, would make for a great film. You know, it would make for a great sequel to I, Robot, which Asimov was writing back in the 1960s, I think. With that by way of introduction, if you could speak to the role of artificial intelligence in what we're talking about, that would be great.
As an educated layperson, artificial intelligence offers tremendous promise, because one could imagine that in a area, for example, of clinical trials and the obstacles to cell therapies and the cost of cell therapies, to designing endpoints and getting to where that needs to go so that cell therapies can be medicine, gene therapies can be medicine, is an onerous task, and it's barely getting started. What artificial intelligence promises is a way of transcending challenges, of targeting and using the immensity of all of these networks, these artificial machine neural networks that are going to accelerate this so rapidly. That's hope, that's promise. Fine, but let's look at that with the people that are wringing their hands, maybe properly so, at unleashing this force with such hurricane strength, category 6 hurricane strength on society that doesn't understand it and doesn't understand how it will necessarily be controlled. And from the standpoint of the zeitgeist and popular culture, you know, the scientists are always bringing about the end of the world. And so many plot lines have computer science and artificial intelligence and robotics and all combined as the eventual end of our species. So which is it? You don't think that debate's going to become very, very relevant very soon? And how much do people really understand the utopian promise of this with the dystopian? And then we come to a whole theater of critics. You know, one of my favorite journals urges the breaking, the slowing down of all of these technologies, I would say, and that's the New Atlantis, right? I consider that the spawn of Leon Kass and Yuval Levin and others. But it's always interesting reading because they raise the specter that we are becoming less human. We're becoming less human. And that is a specter that's hard to answer, really, because it says that defining human as what we might have been years ago, and especially it seems like a focus on Western civilization side of humanity, and suggesting that the new technologies that are here that are accelerating beyond our comprehension almost, and that's going to be a fundamental change in our species, and that's a bad thing, a really, really bad thing for lots and lots of reasons. Well, that thinking has been around for years and years. One could argue, there was this 2-volume set of books that I read in the beginning of this, which you may or may not be able to see, but it is The History of Warfare of Science with Theology in Christendom by Andrew D. White, circa 1909, 1919. You know, meteors, asteroids, the solar system, hygiene, vaccines. There's been a lot of opposition to almost everything that has been an advancement along the way in human knowledge. But we don't know, where the power is so great, that life can be arguably wiped out in an instant or over a time with global warming or some other catastrophe, who's to say that it is time to tap the brakes a little? And from my perspective, when coming in on the human cloning issue, I realize there are societal boundaries and legal boundaries that must be set to consider all the stakeholders. Because if you remove law, the great lubricant of society, if you just toss it out in a world where everything is interconnected, things are just unpredictable.
So let me pose the following to you then. We've all been reading over the last 3 years or so that image processing, particularly with respect to diagnosis of early stage cancer, that diagnostic tools based on image processing are becoming more and more powerful, and may in fact, in a head-to-head comparison, just like AGO, just like the deep learning system AGO in the game of Go beat the world's expert, the diagnostic image processing programs for early stage cancer are, I think, going to do really well in that head-to-head comparison with individual experts. So coming back now to that concept of autonomy, and not the autonomy of the patient, but the autonomy of the physician, that the physician has enjoyed for decades, centuries. What happens in a world where deep learning says, hey, you have cancer, and the world's expert says, you don't have cancer? How do we, that's a specific example of, I think, the sort of issue you're talking about.
Indeed. Whose ox is being gored again? What about the medical establishment as a new era of cell therapies is coming? How about the pharmaceutical industry? You know, are cells going to be the new pills, as Thomas O'Karma famously said, asked or suggested?
Or messenger RNA polymers, oligomers, messenger RNA strands of ribonucleic acid housed in a lipid, a nano-sized lipid particle that can be used as vaccine or therapy. Same question with respect to regenerative medicine.
So here's the thing: if we put medicine in the hands of artificial intelligence, machine learning, if we put those diagnostics and they become apply all over the world, and a pulse event happens, and suddenly the artificial intelligence massive brain is damaged or disappears, will we have the ability on our own to rebuild the knowledge that we have so painstakingly acquired over the millennia, right? And
yeah, if I could just interrupt you for a second, listening to you say that reminds me of the destruction of the Great Library of Alexandria, which may have occurred over 2 or 3 centuries. And of course, I see as one of the starting points of the Dark Ages.
Indeed. So there are probably, if we think about it, other eras of history in civilizations that have collapsed and been utterly forgotten, that are not recognized. I mean, the human brain has evolved over millions and millions of years. It just didn't start with agriculture, right? Okay, that we had these great brains when we were acorn gatherers. To what purpose? One wonders. Who knows? It is what it is, Alan. But here we are today with the sweeping acceleration beyond all human comprehension of all these technologies. Future shock. What can we do? Can we bury our heads in the sand? Or are we going to try to ride this, surf this tsunami and somehow end up in one piece on the beach, in one piece? Well, we can be negative about it. We can pretend it isn't a tsunami. We can run away, or we can deal with it and try to do it in a humane way to get where we need to go. Let's call it, in a world of black swans and randomness, we don't know what the outcome is going to be with any of this. We just work with good faith as best we can with the tools that we have to get around this and hope for the best. And this is all of these technologies are very, very hopeful. And in a world where there's still grinding poverty and suffering, I think calling these salvation technologies is pretty much spot on.
Well, in that respect, one of the issues that arose in a panel discussion that I had with Jean Loring and Graham Parker and Beth Roxland, one of the topics that came up in that conversation, which I think you've touched upon during our interview, our fireside chat this morning, is your reference to distributive justice highlights this, the whole question of diversity. Where does diversity fit in everything that we've been talking about in terms of that brave new world of singularities and beyond singularities to infinity and beyond that we're talking about?
What does diversity really mean? I see people as people. Everyone has their own way of looking at the world and our species. I'm one speck amongst a huge number of billions of people on this planet, right? Everyone has a point of view. Everyone is dealing with the circumstances of life. What are the universal themes, or a universal theme that goes through all of humanity? And I would argue it's healing. Healing. Everyone wants their child to be well. Everyone wants themselves not to suffer in pain. If that is a common denominator, we should be able to use that common denominator to stitch together a better world utilizing the tools and the technology that we have. Because if we don't play the cards right, we're not going to have healing. We could create suffering. We could do something inadvertent that would really be bad. So it's a project, and part of it is understanding everyone's point of view, all the diversity that enriches the human species, and trying to bring people together to share some sort of common goodwill as we move forward.
So in order to achieve that, and thinking again back to that advocate's toolbox, how do we engineer, how do we design diversity into the systems we're talking about? Can we do that? Is there a way to include diversity at the beginning of the design of a system rather than at the end of the design of a system?
Well, I would perhaps shift the question a little bit. How can we not include diversity? In diversity, there is strength. For example, is all of this research just going to be MDs, PhDs, academics? Who's doing the work? the work is done by a workforce. The workforce is a technical workforce that's going to be highly skilled and needs to be trained. In the United States, where are they going to be trained? In high school biotech, in community colleges, in undergraduate, as apprentices and apprenticeships in laboratories. That in itself is a diversity of skill sets that are going to, and training to cope with these new technologies, isn't it? At this World Stem Cell Summit, we have a showcase on India, which is investing heavily in regenerative medicine. Now, we've had a Japan showcase. We've focused on China in past years. This is India's turn to take the stage. And why? Because it represents collaborations. It represents a huge population. It has a great population in need, but a very educated population and great universities. Is that not diversity? I don't look at our field as just in the good old USA, but as a global phenomenon. And how are we going to work together with that?
You know, I think what you just underscored is that from the very beginning, back 17 years ago, it's the World Stem Cell Summit, not the Stem Cell Summit of any particular place on Earth. It's the World Stem Cell Summit.
A little anecdote, of course, we go back more than 17 years because our original meeting was called the Stem Cell Policy and Advocacy Summit, which we did with Baylor College of Medicine. Actually, that's and before that, we had a UN conference at UN headquarters on human cloning and all its aspects, right? So we've been doing meetings and conclaves and sub-meetings and, of course, attending meetings for years and years and years. And you and I have both benefited. We've been on panels and had a chance to interact with all of the communities involved with this. In 2007, we had an event, the World Stem Cell Summit, and our partners weren't confident enough to name the conference World Stem Cell Summit. I lobbied for that at that point in time. And it was only when we did the event actually in Madison, Wisconsin in 2008, that it elevated itself to World Stem Cell Summit. Because as organizers of the meeting, we realized that this was a global phenomenon and it embraced the world. And in 2007, going back to that really important event, because our partners were the Harvard Stem Cell Research Institute. Our partners were the Harvard Stem Cell Institute. The crowning keynote address was from Brooke Ellison. Brooke Ellison was in junior high school, and she was involved, hit by a car, and became paralyzed. And became a friend of Christopher Reeve, and a whole movie was made about her heroic journey. Of course, now she's a PhD teaching at Stony Brook College. But her talk at that time about her own journey really cemented to me not only my own dedication to the field, but I think for all of those individuals in the room, that really was almost a supernova event that really tied in the world of patients as the major stakeholders.
And that, and for years and years, in my mind, the image of patients attending summits, patients in wheelchairs because of that same kind of paralysis that Brooke suffers from, that always made an impact on me.
Well, that was the unmet need as far as conferences went. You know, a civilian going to a a society conference, a science society conference, is going to be looking at slides with a data on top of data, and maybe a picture of a mouse dissected and things like that. But at the World Stem Cell Summit, in the event that we've tried to create, not only are there going to be great scientific presentations, but moreover, it's to provide a context for the world, and also allowing patients that I consider myself as a patient advocate, even more so than a lawyer or an organizer of conferences or a head of a foundation, to bring the civilians and stakeholders into this, because with public appreciation, you can do anything. Without it, nothing gets done. So said Abraham Lincoln, right? That's what it means to be an advocate. And understanding advocacy as the cornerstone upon which all of this is built is a really valuable observation.
So Bernie, I think we may be coming up to the 60 minutes that we had thought we would spend on this topic, or this set of topics, applying advocacy tools and public policy tools to emerging issues in regenerative medicine, like AI and racing off to space and longevity. With that in mind, I think we ended up with something a bit different from what we thought. And of course, this was all unscripted, so we went where we went. But I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about that in conclusion.
In conclusion, Alan, I think if anyone happens to stumble across this presentation, they will realize that we are colleagues that have been through policy issues and wars together, and co-authored a book chapter, and wrote advisory letters to the NIH. We've been through a lot with this field and building events, bringing this world together. And I think that was the real story that had me going as I was thinking about all that. And I think that it can apply to all of those great platforms of AI and longevity, space. The tools, the toolkit are there. People can look that up and apply that to any kind of advocacy matter or cause. But what we've done is explore at least our journey in this and what has inspired us for what it's worth. And the fact that this will be viewed by people who care about the field might find a value in it. You certainly were able to get me to open up about my feelings and thoughts about this matter that I've devoted my life to for close to 20 years. And I appreciate that. So I think this might see the light of day, and we can always talk about more about AI and some of these other issues at our next summit, or any time that you want to pick up the phone and talk to me. But I appreciate you sharing this, and I can't think of a better person or friend that would rather do a fireside chat with than my good friend and colleague, Alan Jakimo.
Bernie, thank you. There's no way that I can, well, the sentiments are mutual, igualmente, as they say in Spanish. So thank you. And I appreciate the opportunity that you've given me over the years to assist you in what you've been doing. So I want to thank you very, very much. And there's so much more to follow, and to infinity and beyond.
Up we go.
Yes.